This is the story of how, in the glow of the high mountains of Colorado, amidst the beauty of vast forests and rushing mountain rivers, one family faced their greatest horror, the disappearance of a child. A little 3-year-old boy named Jared Natadero went missing on October 2, 1999, in an area that at first glance was just a quiet place for Sunday strolls. His father, Alan, was in charge of organizing recreation for a religious group. He had no idea that their serene pastime would turn into a real tragedy that day. The children's shoes, discovered years later on a steep mountain slope, have come to symbolize great pain and a mystery that seems never to be fully solved. Why does this story generate so much controversy and continue to preoccupy the minds of dozens of people, from investigators and reporters to curious everyday people, and the many volunteers who have tried to help in the search? When a young child disappears, every moment counts. Every missed piece of evidence has the potential to cause irreparable consequences. In Jared's case, opinions were divided. Some were convinced that the boy had fallen victim to a mountain lion. Others suspected he had been kidnapped. Still, others saw signs of a possible accident. Add to that the tremendous stress on the family, unprecedented media coverage, and outright inconsistencies in the search and rescue operation, and you have one of the most controversial mountain disappearances in the United States. Days, weeks, months, and years have passed since the disappearance, with an initial active search involving multiple volunteers, search and rescue teams, film crews, and even military helicopters, before the investigation began to falter. Instead of the expected happy ending, new questions were added. Why did the clothing attributed to the missing child contain almost no traces of blood or signs of decomposition? How did some experienced trackers fail to find the items near the official trailhead? And why did the remains found fall more than 150 meters above the trail? What are the reasons for the county sheriff's rigid refusal to interact with family members? And finally, could the boy have been saved if people had shown a little more organization and discipline in the beginning? October 2, 1999 looked like a quiet Saturday afternoon to Alan Natadero, the owner of a small resort located in scenic Poudre Canyon. The resort was about 45 minutes west of Fort Collins, Colorado. Alan was preparing to meet a group from the Christian Singles Network, people who had decided to spend a weekend in nature, get some fresh air, perhaps make new friends, or be spiritually enriched. Such gatherings had been held on his property many times before, and there seemed to be nothing extraordinary in the plans of the guests. Other participants in these gatherings included Janet, a close friend of the Natadero family, as well as Alan's 2 children, 6-year-old daughter Jocelyn and 3-year-old son Jared. In the morning, at about 9 o'clock, someone in the group suggested a trip to the fish hatchery. The place was 5 miles west of the resort, not too far, but well outside the usual recreation area. The trails there were considered relatively safe, especially near the hatchery where the fish were raised. When Jocelyn, inspired by the adventure ahead, approached her father and asked permission to go along with Janet, Alan almost didn't object. He was sure the two would spend some time at the hatchery, perhaps look at the pools of fry, and return safely. 10 minutes later, little Jared approached his father with the same request. The 3-year-old was known for his inquisitive and energetic nature. At first, Alan hesitated. He realized that the boy was more restless than his older sister, but the people in the group assured him that they would be happy to look after the child. The persuasion was stronger than the father's doubts, and Jared also went for a mini walk. At this point in the stories of eyewitnesses begin to appear the first inaccuracies, indicating that further events did not develop so smoothly. The hikers themselves recalled that their hike to the hatchery was too short and boring. One of them wanted to take a more real mountain trail and advised them to go to the Big South Trail. To do so, they traveled about half an hour deep into the canyon, but in their haste, they did not think it necessary to warn Alan about their new route. The trail was known for its magnificent views, but it was also known for its dangers: narrow passes, sharp cliffs, long climbs and descents, potentially risky for small children. Nevertheless, the group decided to take the risk, as none of them seemed to realize the full complexity of the local terrain. When they finally reached the start of the trail around 10:30 a.m., the hikers broke into 3 small subgroups, each going at a different pace. The 11-person collective, according to the Larimer County Sheriff's Office, didn't even really know each other. The level of organization was questionable. No one had assigned responsibility for the children. No one had assigned roles for supervision or for navigating the unfamiliar mountainous terrain. At the same time, little Jared, seeing the new expanse and encouraged by the atmosphere of the wilderness, rushed forward with childlike enthusiasm. The 3-year-old's curiosity clearly outpaced his caution. By about 10:40 a.m., the first 2 subgroups were already on the trail, and the third, according to some accounts, was also about to catch up with them. Jared found himself somewhere between the second and third groups. Some of the participants suggested that the boy should stay in Janet's care or join his sister Jocelyn, but few realized how easy it was to lose sight of a small child on a mountain trail. As the boys moved at different paces, stopping periodically to admire waterfalls and peer into beautiful gorges, there was no structured movement. According to one of the women ahead of them, Jared would lunge forward every now and then, but he wouldn't respond to her shouts. He could only look back, but he kept running. When the group made short rest stops, they didn't really check to see where the child was. After a while, there were 2 fishermen following the same route. They overtook some of the tourists, and Jared, seeing the new people, ran after them, perhaps hoping to ask something or just to continue getting to know the unfamiliar adults. Children's openness and curiosity played a fatal role here. Someone tried to call out to the boy, to warn him not to go too far away. One of the men even told the others to keep the boy close. But, as is often the case with general outings, all responsibility dissolved in the collective. Someone had to look out. Someone else had to pay attention. Someone else had to decide whether it was dangerous to go further. In the end, the child simply disappeared from sight. At about 11:20, a half hour after getting on the trail, Jared was no longer seen. Around 11:30, some participants heard a child screaming. According to some recollections, it sounded like it was cheerful or playful. According to others, it sounded more like it was frightened. But unfortunately, no one went to check what it was. The hikers continued on their way, hoping that they would catch up with the boy soon or that he would come back to them. When it became clear that the child wasn't around and wasn't coming back, the group began to belatedly worry. At first, they looked for him in the immediate neighborhood, calling his name. But the boy didn't respond. Some went forward to see if other travelers had seen Jared. Some went back, hoping to find him at the beginning of the trail. The results were nil. Finally, 2 of the group decided to return to Alan and give him the shocking news. Jared is missing and no one knows where he is. His father, naturally, felt horrified. "What do you mean he's missing?" he asked, puzzled as to how a little boy could be lost in just a couple hours after starting his walk. He rushed to his car and drove to the place where the group had left the transportation, all the while repeating, "They lost my baby." When Alan realized how far the tourists had gone, which was a distance of 15 to 26 kilometers from the resort, he was stunned. It seemed inconceivable to him that someone would consider such a walk suitable for a 3-year-old child. But time was already running out. The resort manager immediately called a search and rescue team, and Alan, ahead of the rescuers, rushed down the trail in a desperate attempt to find his son. He ran and called out, "Jared! J-Rod! Little brother!" But the farther he climbed, the more he realized how vast and difficult the terrain was. Soon, he had to return to give the coordinates and try to help the teams by radio. From that point on, the search began, in scope turning into one of the most high-profile search operations in Larimer County. A Larimer County Sheriff's deputy arrived along with search and rescue representatives. At that point, Alan had already traveled part of the trail in an attempt to find his son on his own. The parents' shock and confusion grew by the minute. 6-year-old Jocelyn, Jared's sister, said she didn't remember all the details very well because she was a toddler at the time. But she remembered her father returning with a forlorn look and seeing him cry for the first time in his life. For a child, it was a clear signal. Something terrible had happened. The organization of the search was set up quickly. People began to scour the trail in both directions, to go down to the river, to examine the slopes and boulders, to look for any traces, screams, sounds. Professional canines with dogs trained to search for both living people and human remains were also involved. By the decision of the sheriff, a helicopter belonging to the Air Force Base in Cheyenne, Wyoming was used. However, things got even more complicated when that military helicopter was involved in an accident the following morning. During an approach over a mountainous area, maneuvering in difficult conditions of strong wind gusts and variable weather, the pilot lost control. The machine went down from about 100-meter height and crashed onto the Great Southern Trail. On board, in addition to 4 military personnel, was a volunteer from the Larimer County Search and Rescue Team, Mark Sheets. Fortunately, everyone survived the crash but was severely injured. The helicopter itself was destroyed. This event shook the entire rescue camp. Suddenly, there was a double problem: to continue the search for the missing child while at the same time helping the comrades who were in the airplane crash. Some experienced members of the group had to switch to rescuing victims, and the area to be surveyed was still huge and extremely difficult. The intense media attention did not add to the optimism either. News of a 3-year-old child missing in the mountains and a helicopter crash quickly spread across the state and beyond. Journalists from major TV stations and newspapers began arriving at the canyon, setting up camps with off-site studios and satellite dishes. People showed up with all sorts of offers of help, including psychics wanting to get in touch with the boy's soul, and strange-looking volunteers who added confusion to an already confusing situation. As a result, the Larimer County Sheriff began restricting access to the trail to avoid injuries and unauthorized tampering. However, the Natadero family took these restrictions very hard. Alan and his relatives wanted to participate in the search, but they were explicitly told that parental interference was allegedly interfering with the professionals. According to their recollections, the sheriff even threatened to arrest Alan if he tried to enter the restricted area. A serious conflict arose. The father could not stand by, knowing that his young son was somewhere in the mountains, possibly frightened or injured. However, officials felt that this was the right thing to do. Meanwhile, the search continued with all sorts of means. Additional rescue teams were called in. Divers surveyed the Cache La Poudre River, although it was not deep. Pilots of other helicopters and small airplanes flew over the canyon, trying to spot anything unusual. But time passed, and no sign of Jared could be found. Not even the dogs picked up a steady scent trail that would indicate the boy's exact direction of travel. When the search dragged on and turned into a helicopter crash, a variety of versions began to circulate in the press and among rescuers. At official briefings, the sheriff repeatedly mentioned that Jared could have fallen into the river and drowned. The Siberian, mountainous conditions of the river, he said, could have kept the body on the bottom, and the cold water supposedly prevented rapid decomposition so that the remains might not have surfaced until many months or even years later. However, divers who surveyed the riverbed indicated that the water level was very low, and the bottom itself was quite rocky and viewable. Large piles of logs, of course, made the search difficult, but experts estimated the chances of finding a body in the river as very high if someone had really drowned there. At the same time, a version of a possible mountain lion attack began to gain popularity. This hypothesis seemed more plausible to some people because mountain lions, cougars, are found in Larimer County, and there were precedents of attacks on people. However, most of these cases involved adults, or at least older children, who might have entered the predator's territory carelessly. On the other hand, a 3-year-old boy was not a difficult prey If he really encountered a puma, and the proximity of high vegetation and rock shelters gave the lion every chance to approach unnoticed. There was, however, an important question. Where was the blood and torn shreds of clothing, which are usually left after a predatory attack? Where are the traces of struggle and dragged-away remains? Could it be that the cougar dragged the boy somewhere high up in the mountains? On the crest of all these assumptions appeared an even more exotic versions. Thus, some researchers referred to the writer and ufologist David Paulides, known for publications about mysterious disappearances of people in national parks. Paulides claimed that in many cases, missing children are found in places where search parties have repeatedly passed by. There were even hints of supernatural reasons for the disappearances. And some witnesses added their own stories of strange creatures supposedly living in the depths of the forest. All this grew into speculation and legends, while the official authorities assured that such theories were unsubstantiated. By the same time, the sheriff's office began receiving numerous phone calls from volunteer deputies. People called, claiming to be clairvoyants, witch doctors. Some reported another vision of the boy's whereabouts. One woman begged to go to a flooded cave where the vibration of Jared's spirit was particularly strong. In most cases, such clues had no factual corroboration. Not only that, but individuals, in an attempt to become famous for the tragedy, provided deliberately distorted information and even false testimony. One Fort Collins resident was arrested for repeatedly lying to police, claiming to be an informant. All of this slowed the professional search, unnerved already stressed officers, and further traumatized the family. By the time the search for Jared had been going on for a week, the situation looked bleak. No trace of the boy could be found at all. No clothes, no bloodstains, no scraps of cloth, no toys he might have been carrying, not even obvious prints on the muddy parts of the trail. The dogs picked up false tracks from time to time, but they didn't lead to any real finds. Alan and Deborah, Alan's ex-wife, tried desperately to expand the search area and call for volunteers. However, the Larimer County Sheriff was increasingly restricting this. The number of non-professional searchers roaming the woods was growing, and authorities feared accidents or loss of evidence. When it became clear that the success rate was minimal, the sheriff made the difficult decision to end the official search, leaving only a standby mode in case any new clues or evidence surfaced. For Notadero's family, it came as a real blow. How can the search be stopped when a 3-year-old child is still missing? But officials insisted that all possible measures have been exhausted. Rescuers and volunteers recognized that the area was too vast, and if the boy had wandered far off the trail or been dragged away by an animal, there was virtually nowhere to look and nothing to get a grip on. On the other hand, the father's mind was still spinning with thoughts of a possible kidnapping. After all, it was possible that someone could have taken the baby out of the woods and taken him away. But the sheriff's department had interviewed everyone involved that day and found no reason to make an arrest. No obvious criminals or suspicious individuals were seen in the canyon one by one. Another sore subject slips through in such cases: a lack of coordination among the various agencies. The sheriff's office, the wildlife department, volunteer units, the military. Many experienced searchers complained that their services were simply not needed, and they left, leaving contact information that was later lost. It looked as if the official authorities were refusing any uncoordinated help. Alan Notadero recalled that he almost secretly brought in people who could read footprints on rocks and debris to continue the search on their own. But all was in vain. After a few more months, the investigation faded, although the discussions around the case did not subside. The family sank into an exhausting wait. Every phone call gave them hope. What if there's a witness? Maybe Jared is alive and has been seen in a neighboring state. Occasionally, indeed, there were reports of a boy who looked like Jared. But no amount of checking yielded positive results. Sometimes there were even imposters who claimed to be the missing child, but DNA tests quickly dispelled the illusions. The real breakthrough in the case came only in 2003, when two Fort Collins hikers, Gary Watts and Rob Osborne, hiked the Great Southern Trail area. As they climbed up a scree slope about 150 feet above where people usually hiked, they suddenly noticed a child's sneaker. At first, the men were only vaguely concerned, but when they saw a second sneaker and pieces of fleece sweater nearby, they realized they had stumbled upon something important. Fragments of blue sweatpants, turned inside out, were lying nearby. The material looked as if it had been plucked by birds for nests. Some pieces of fabric had been individually melted away, but some remained intact. Puzzled by this, Watts and Osborne remembered the story of a missing 3-year-old child. They photographed everything they found, being careful not to move the items, and then carefully collected the shoes and sweater to give to the sheriff. They had to return almost in the evening, and it wasn't until the next day that they were able to officially report the find to the sheriff's office, attaching the pictures. The investigators, on ascending the said slope, found the clothes scattered over a small area. They also found small bone fragments resembling children's bones. Sometime later, a fragment of the upper part of the skull and a single tooth were found in the same area. Experts immediately conducted DNA testing, but because of the poor condition of the bones and the peculiarities of the technology used, received only a probable match with the samples that belonged to Jared. They were taken from his parents. It took several additional procedures to finally confirm that the find was indeed linked to the missing boy. Soon the sheriff issued a statement to the press. "We are in a high degree of confidence that these are the remains of Jared Natadero." The official hypothesis that was voiced again was a mountain lion attack. The reasoning was that the belongings were found high above the trail, where the animal may have dragged the child away. In addition, some of the clothing allegedly had puncture wounds or marks resembling fangs. However, many details of the find raised doubts. First, there was no blood or decomposition stains on the clothing. If the child had been dragged away by a cougar, an abundance of biological traces would have been expected. Second, the sweatpants were turned up and appeared to have been removed very carefully, not torn during the struggle. No large leg or pelvic bones were found, which also seemed odd in a lion attack. The fleece sweater was whole, although they found small punctures on it, the origin of which they could not determine for sure. The question was, why had none of these fragments been found during the first week of the search, when hundreds of people were scouring the trail and the neighboring slopes? The place where it was found was not so inaccessible, and it's quite possible that someone had been there before. After the official discovery of the remains and clothing, active discussions around the case resumed. State forensic investigators found no traces of animal DNA on the fabric, and furthermore, no human hair either. According to the boy's father, Alan, he sought retests by contacting independent labs. One report said there was mixed genetic material in the samples from the tooth, hinting at the presence of someone else's DNA. But further testing was not properly done, as the tooth was shredded and disposed of in the process, leaving the family with no way to double-check the results. Authorities eventually issued a death certificate stating that the cause was undetermined. In official communications, however, the sheriff and other county representatives continued to stick to the most likely attacked by a mountain lion explanation. To experts familiar with the behaviors of big cats, this scenario looked unconvincing. Signs of a predatory attack are usually clearly visible by tattered clothing, an abundance of fur, and the characteristic arrangement of bones. If a lioness had dragged off a 3-year-old child, it is unlikely that the pants would have remained nearly clean and the boots would have been found so close together. There has also been discussion of the theory that the boy could have fallen off the cliff, and later his remains were scattered by animals or birds. Conspiracy theorists pointed out, what if Jared was kidnapped? My father had a story about a park ranger who saw a boy who looked like Jared running toward a strange man. But that tip had never been corroborated by the sheriff. At the document level, it had been ignored, according to Alan. There were also some suspicious phone calls where an unknown man posed as a police officer and said, "You're being told lies. When everything is revealed, we'll come to your side." But these promises remained empty. Many people, journalists, volunteers, law enforcement officers, went through the whole thing. Each one added a new detail or version that was either shattered by the facts or never developed. During this period, the father and family members felt that the investigation was losing focus. Instead of a clear search for evidence, public statements and the accepted script were becoming increasingly important. Alan Natadero emphasized that he never considered the mountain lion hypothesis as proven. He suggested that the sheriff chose such an explanation because it closes the case in the eyes of the public. But it was not legally confirmed. Technically, the case of missing 3-year-old Jared Natadero was closed back in 2003 as the remains were found and the cause of death procedure stalled. But for the child's relatives and the dozens of rescuers and volunteers who spent time and energy, the story wasn't over. Alan said that for years his life became a never-ending investigation. He published a book, Missing When the Sun Goes Down, where he detailed the experiences, mistakes by authorities, and oddities he and other volunteers noticed during the active search. Thus ended one of the most mysterious and difficult missing child stories in Colorado. It still appeals to the conscience of those who go hiking, calls for better preparation for the trails, and more thoughtful consideration for the safety of young children. 3 years, this is the age of innocent curiosity, when any brightly colored object or adult figure may seem more interesting than mom's instructions to stay close. And yet, it's an age when a child is still completely defenseless against the elements. Jared Natadero's sad experience is a reminder that nature cannot be played with carelessness. We need to be aware and attentive at any moment on any trail. That's all for now. If you enjoyed this piece, please support it with a like and subscribe to see more stories like this. Thank you for your attention and see you soon. Bye.